So I want to invite you to consider the meaning of climate literacy. What is it? Why we need it? How do we make it part of our teaching, of our research? And in particular, what do stories have to do with climate literacy? As we begin, I ask you to also introduce yourselves in the chat room. If we do this, give us your name, pronouns, where you're coming from, and your subject area or grade level if you're a teacher. And throughout, I will also invite you to answer a few short questions. This is optional. Justina will post links to these Google Forms in the forum as we go. And there is also a downloadable Word document with these 5 forms. Each has 3 to 4 questions that you can download. And Justina, if you can post this link in the chat, that'd be great. And if you're okay with giving me a permission to use these answers, anonymized, of course, in my research, I would really love to get the feedback from you on these questions of climate literacy, especially coming from teachers and educators. So let's start with the first form. Justina, if you can post the link to Google Form 1 and to get us all warmed up. So these are 4 multiple choice questions. I don't see a chat on my end, so I hope that you are able to see the link and access the form. So the form asks 4 questions. How climate literate do you consider yourself to be? And we have 4 options. Then the second question is, how concerned are you about climate change and its present/future consequences? Then you have 3 options. The third question, how much did you learn about climate change at school? Then you have 3 options. And the fourth question is, what do you think should be the place of climate literacy in 21st century education? And it's also a multiple choice question. So Justina or someone, if you can confirm that the link has been shared in the chat.
Yes, it has been shared.
Okay, excellent. So and of course you can take your time answering these questions. You don't need to complete any of the forms. Each form, I think, has a submit button at the end. So whenever you're done during the talk or after the talk, once you click submit, the form all of your answers will be uploaded. Okay. So I don't want to start with any clear answers to the what can I do question, because I don't have these answers. But I want to start elsewhere, and I want to start with 2 examples. The first inspiration I want to draw on is the last public appearance of late Sir Ken Robinson, recorded from his London home during lockdown in August 2020. Many of you are probably familiar with Robinson's work on creativity, diversity, and imagination in education. And in this last talk, and there is a link that Justina can share with you, it's called Creating the New Normal. And in this last talk, Robinson identified climate, the disconnect from natural world, and the climate change as 2 of the greatest challenges facing us today. And he said that the pandemic gives us an opportunity to imagine a new normal, because the factory model we have used so far is destructive, and as destructive as industrial monocrop agriculture, destructive to the planet, animals, plants, and to human capacities as well. So Robinson argues in this talk that our opportunity now is to discard the educational equivalents of monocrops, pesticides, and chemical fertilization. The challenge for us is to reimagine education, and this is a quote, to make a settlement with the earth, plants, animals, and all life. So we need education for Earthlings based on compassion, collaboration, creativity, and diversity. And he does not use the term climate literacy, but the way I understand this call is that our new normal requires education steeped in climate literacy. So that's one inspiration. The second inspiration is a 2016 TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie on the danger of a single story. And you've probably seen it multiple times. And I know that teachers, especially in the US, have used this talk to explain the need for multicultural literature in the classroom. Because, so the argument is this, that unless you're exposed to different stories that deepen your understanding, you will be enslaved by a single story, a story that blinds you to the reality and complexity of that specific issue. So my suggestion is that Adichie's point about how stories can be used to dispossess or to empower is valid not just for our grasp of multiculturalism. It is also valid for our grasp of where we are as a global civilization in relation to our planetary home. And specifically, I think that our civilization is now locked in a single story. And this is a single story, a magical thinking narrative in which our future is one of accelerating expansion, including into space, with more of everything and infinite growth. It's the future of benevolent billionaire overlords, the future of mind-boggling technologies for the few, of course, like Elon Musk's Mars colony, and the future of singularity in which rich old men can upload their consciousness into cloud and live forever. Paradoxically, this single-story future is not that different from a host of other end-of-time ideologies, including those of ISIS, Christian Zionism, and doomsday preppers that we are seeing everywhere. So there's a book, Recapturing the Rapture, and the author, Jamie Wheal, calls these constructs rapture ideologies. Rapture ideologies offer each one of them offers a variation on a single story that goes like this. The current world is unsavable. 2, it will collapse very soon. 3, me and my group will make it to the other side. We will survive. 4, so let's just hasten it all, the ending, and let's hasten the arrival of this purged world. This narrative structure of the redemption of the few at the expense of the many is driving the current wealth gap, biodiversity crash, climate change, and the wholesale destruction of the biosphere. Like Afghan Mujahideen and ISIS fighters in their local capacities, our political and business elites are effectively acting to drive this world off the cliff as soon as possible. And whether they believe that God will save them or the market will save them, they are blinded by a single story. Let's take a break now and go to Google Form 2. Justina, if you can paste the link in the chat. And there are 3 questions in this form, but I just want you to answer the first one. Do you know anyone who has embraced one or another version of a rapture ideology? And it can be yourself. I find rapture ideologies incredibly tempting. They offer a way out. And there is a wide variety of rapture ideologies that are presented in ways that it's so easy to subscribe to them and to believe that, okay, we will make it. We are the good guys. We will make it to the other end of this story. So take your time to look at this form or answer at least one question if you so please. But I want to say another thing going forward, that one place to consider the reality of climate change is to recognize that our mainstream culture is locked in a single story. But for those who question the single story, reality presents a different picture. And this picture can be found in scientific reports and in narratives on non-mainstream climate movements like Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, Fridays for Future, and so forth. So what is this picture? A British eco-philosopher, Rupert Read, puts it like this, that we're facing 3 broad possible futures. 1, we will somehow manage to transform rapidly our ecocidal civilization into an ecological one. 2, our ecocidal civilization will collapse, but it will manage to seed a successor civilization as it falls. And the third option is that this ecocidal civilization will collapse utterly and terminally, victim of climate instability, resource depletion, and the conflicts that these emergencies would engender. Again, The political and financial institutions of our petrocapitalist world refuse to consider any of these three futures. Their single story is a story of eternal growth in the market economy and expansion into space. A story where even the threat of imminent planetary destruction is downplayed in favor of corporate profit. There was one recent allegory is the film Don't Look Up, which some of you may know, which is not far from being a perfect allegory, but it sort of goes in the direction. But where I find hope is both the fact that scientists continue their work, and second, that young people are getting angry. Activists like Greta Thunberg, Vanessa Nakata, and many others, they are our time's equivalents of the emperor's new clothes. Teenagers recognizing how our social political order is caught up in self-serving illusions, that we are victims of a single story. And I think that a growing number of adults are also considering the question that Thunberg asks, like, well, if solutions within this system are so impossible, how about we change the system? So there is a sense, I think, that we are entering a popular revolt against a dysfunctional, entrenched system. So, of course, the next question is, okay, how do you change the system? So my suggestion, not only mine, like it's been written about and presented a lot, that we start with visions of alternatives to the way things are. And visions need stories to be communicated. Find the right story, build coalitions, and change will happen. And I now want to show you two clips. Each is a story with a little bit of message. So let's watch them together and then answer two questions. And if you're able to paste the link to form number 3, that'd be great. So let's watch the two clips.
Dreamed a dream in times gone by, when hope was high and life worthy. I dreamed that love would never die. I dreamed that God would be forgiving. Then I was young and unafraid, and dreams were made, used and wasted. But the tigers come at night, with their voices soft as thunder, as they tear your rope apart, as they turn your dream to shame. And still I dream he'll come to me, that we will live the years together. There are dreams that cannot be, and there are storms we cannot weather. I had a dream my life would be so different from this hell I live in. So different now from what it seemed.
Okay, so this was one clip, and this is another. And for both, the question is, how did the clip make you feel?
A holy man, a man with connections. But what will he do when God's lovingly created planet comes under attack?
If we destroy creation, creation will destroy us. It's time to take out the trash.
A planet fighting for God's creation.
Come on, you holiness.
Tireless. Fearless.
This hope must be stopped. Coal, oil, gas, these are God-given gifts, and they are ours for the taking.
Unstoppable.
Forgive me, Father. Nature never forgives. If you slap it, it will always slap you back.
He is an easy man to follow and a hard man to silence. But in this epic battle against climate crisis, we can't let him fight alone. This summer, to save our world, one man,
Come on, Francis.
will risk it all.
Power of me compels you. Francis!
Pope Francis in the encyclical.
To change everything, we need everyone.
Coming to Earth this June.
Okay, so this was not the real Pope, just in case you were wondering. But the point here, and these are two of the many, many, many excellent short clips available on climate change and climate action on YouTube. And there's a ton of channels that are doing this work. But the whole point here is that there is no better way to mobilize climate action than stories. Stories speak to us in personal terms. And unless we make climate change a personal concern for everyone, which it is in a fundamental existential sense of survival, the change will be hard to achieve and too slow. We need discussions about climate change to be happening in families, in schools, in communities, in churches, in businesses, everywhere. It is not an issue that we can leave to experts or politicians alone. And for this big discussion to happen, we need to do three things. We need to, 1, communicate the urgency. 2, define what we're talking about. 3, stress the opportunity for positive change. So first, the urgency. And of course, you've probably read or heard and are familiar with so much science so far that you don't need other evidence. But the point is that we are in an existential challenge. And the question of how we transition from this carbon-intense civilization to an ecological civilization in which we flourish in harmony with the biosphere is probably the most important question we should be asking. Plus, it is not a challenge that something that can happen in 50 or 20 years in the future. It's something that must be done now. And you're probably familiar with this term called the Great Acceleration. And it's just one of the terms to describe how fast things are progressing across the board. The last IPCC report released in 2021, so this is the 2018 report, which said that we need rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban infrastructure, and industrial systems, unprecedented in terms of scale, not necessarily of speed. So it says we can do it. And this report in 2018 identified 1.5 Celsius instead of 2, which was the case in 2 degrees in the Paris Agreement, because we sort of now know that 1.5 Celsius is the threshold under which our civilization is most likely to survive. It's our Titanic moment, the point before which we can still change the course of our civilization and we can avoid disaster. The 2021 report, which was released in August last year, says that we're on track to pass the 1.5 Celsius of temperature rise as early as in the mid-2030s, which sometimes maybe in some scenarios, it's even 2032, so 10 years from now. And it's a curse and a blessing that most people don't realize how serious the situation is. This is one of the recent articles from 2021. And if you look at the second, third sentence, the scale of the threats is in fact so great that it is difficult to grasp for even well-informed experts. Even the smartest among us find it really hard to wrap our minds around how narrow the window of opportunity is and how fast feedback loops among many drivers of climate change accelerate the destruction across the board. Like when I look at my own life, I was born a month after the first Earth Day in 1970. The human population stood at 3.6 billion. I'm 52 now, and the human population has more than doubled to 7.9 billion. So in the same period, can you guess what happened to the global population of wild animals? Of course, it decreased, but decreased by, and it's the average drop is 68%. This is a higher percentage, slightly higher percentage than that of the victims of the Jewish Holocaust. And at this rate, every single animal species you know from children's books will be gone in our lifetimes. So, and this is biodiversity crash, which is super real, super serious. Likewise, global warming, another massive process that's happening now. It's not only happening, and it's not only going fast, it's going faster, despite all climate negotiations and agreements. Between 1990, so by now, like at this point in 2022, we are at 1.1 Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So can you guess how much of this global warming has happened in the 30 years between 1990 and 2020? 0.5 of Celsius. So this is almost half of the entire global warming to date, which means that in the 30 years between 1990 and 2020, we increased atmospheric CO2 as much as we did in the entire lifespan of the human species until 1990. So at this rate we're going today, we're headed for temperature rise of about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius in our lifetime. This would be creating Mars on Earth. So across the board, we're rapidly approaching planetary thresholds, the crossing of any of which would be unimaginably catastrophic. And the urgency today is to realize that we can still avoid these worst scenarios, which takes us to the second point, to define what is it that we're talking about. One problem with large concepts such as climate change is that they're hyper objects. They're so dispersed in time and space relative to our human scale that we can never really fully describe them. Megafires are expressions of climate change, but they're not climate change itself. So to more violent hurricanes, more persistent droughts, climate migrations from Syria or from the dry corridor in Central America, all of these are manifestations of climate change, but none is climate change itself. So we need to recognize this complexity, but we should not be intimidated by it. And we need strategies to deal with this complexity. So one strategy is to help our students grasp the relationship between climate change and global warming. And of course, global warming is the mother of all issues, as Al Gore has called it, but it refers only to one very specific thing. It's the measurable rise in the global mean surface temperature of the Earth caused by anthropogenic activity, especially the burning of fossil fuels. But climate change is this wider, less precisely quantifiable term. The United Nations Climate Agency is called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change rather than on global warming, environmental crisis, the Anthropocene, or so forth, because climate change is this best term. It's clunky, but it's still the best term we have for an open-ended range of consequences with global warming interacting and affecting living systems through feedback loops with other processes, pollution, desertification, deforestation, species extinction, soil erosion, and you name it. So it's a huge, ever-growing cluster of processes and relations that are not limited to the environment. And our students should know that climate change has equally serious social, political, and economic consequences for human societies and, of course, for non-human life as well, and the planet as a whole. So that's one strategy. Another strategy related to building climate literacy is to stress that becoming climate literate does not require perfect knowledge. What it means is that we don't need complete knowledge. We need adequate knowledge to act. Another challenge is to define what are we talking about when we put this term climate literacy. And at this point, we don't have any widely accepted definition. In 2009, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration proposed a term climate science literacy, which is basically the idea that people should understand climate science, what climate science is saying. And the definition they proposed is an understanding of your influence on climate and climate's influence on you and society. Okay, that's a good start. But over the past few years, we've kind of realized that knowing the science behind something is not exactly the same as knowing this thing in a lived practice. You may know everything about how a car engine works or how a car works, but it doesn't really make you a good driver. So climate science literacy matters, but climate literacy is a more integrated and more a multidisciplinary cultural competence. And I've used a working definition of climate literacy that goes something like that. It's an understanding of anthropogenic climate change that translates into a lived embrace of a responsibility to stand up for everyone's biospheric inheritance and empowers us to develop ecocentric values, attitudes, and priorities. This definition is probably too long. It's clunky. It's sort of a single sentence would be best, but this is the best I have so far. And we need to have discussions about what exactly we mean when we talk about climate literacy. So like on my end, one of my insights or positions that I've arrived at so far is that climate literacy cannot be a purely conceptual knowledge. It cannot be disengaged from lived action. You cannot know these things and do the opposite. That would be the definition of climate illiteracy. So we need far more discussions about what climate literacy is and how to achieve it. But one other thing we need to have a really new vocabulary. So at this point, I want to invite you to form 4, if Justina can share it. And this is a form that asks you, like, test your climate literacy vocabulary. Like, can you identify these terms? Slow violence, half Earth, carbon budget, ecocide, GP. And these are just some of the terms that are, I think, important for climate literacy in different degrees, but still, I mean, so this is again, a multiple choice questions for each of these. Okay. So while you maybe tackle 1 or 2 of these, here's an example, and here's like part of my conclusion at this point is that, okay, so if the key driver of planetary destruction is our global economic system through which we organize the planet's resources, labor, production, distribution, capitalism is the culprit, that's correct. But entangled with neoliberalism is another force, a force that is older, more primal, more destructive, yet also more amenable to healing through education. And this force is climate illiteracy. If we were climate literate, economy would not be a problem. If we were climate literate, technology would not be a problem. The problem is that we are a climate illiterate society. So my third point, maybe the most important point here, is that we must stress the opportunity for positive change because climate illiteracy can be overcome. And just how climate illiteracy works, climate illiteracy is pretty much a disconnect between different domains of knowing. So one example is that it was on the same day that the 2021 IPCC report was published, the Canadian Minister of Environment and Climate Change explained that Canada will expand the pipeline to carry tar sands oil to the Pacific because they need this money, the revenue from this project, to fight climate change. I mean, take a moment to like let it sink in how disconnected this argument is. And the disconnect between these two mutually exclusive goals is how climate illiteracy works in practice. And I suggest that this is the reframing we need. Climate change is the unintended consequence of processes set in motion by our climate illiterate society. To turn this around, we need new technologies, of course, but we also need universal climate literacy, the kind of literacy that includes knowing scientific facts, but it centers values and attitudes aligned with how we should live to respect our planetary home. And for this kind of literacy, K through 12 classrooms are ground zero. Today, young people feel that schools are failing them. They take to the streets to fight for their futures. They go on school strikes, and which, of course, they should. But we need these protests. But what we also need, and where our responsibility is as adults, is to put climate literacy front and centers in our schools as well. And if we agree on, okay, let's do that, then of course the challenge is, okay, how do you teach climate literacy? And there's a whole host of challenges. One is conceptual, and we already talked about that climate change is just too big to grasp. Can you really imagine the 51.8 gigatons of CO2 emitted by the world in 2018? Or can you really imagine 3 billion animals that perished in Australia's fires? But even if you could imagine these numbers, how meaningful would they be? So since our minds are unable to process big data, and we know it, the solution here is to build on what our minds are best at, what they are hardwired for. And we are hardwired for thinking in stories. Vanishing habitats, other aspects of climate change can be presented in numbers and charts, but the message gets really compelling when it's told in a story, like Sir David Attenborough's documentaries, or Mordecai Bernstein's The Boy and the Whale, or a ton of other wonderful picture books and novels for young audiences. The thing is that climate change is not primarily a technical challenge. It's a challenge for our imaginations and story systems. So this is where, okay, this is a great trailer, but we probably will not have time for it. You look it up yourselves. But this is where literature and stories come in. This is our opportunity to leverage stories, specifically children's literature and media, to teach universal climate literacy from the ground up and across all subject areas, not as a subject, but across all subject areas. Teachers are the boots on the ground in this push. And no task, I think, is more important for academics today than to support teachers in this effort. Because no matter what happens in the academia, we alone cannot be the force for change. We need teachers, we need schools, and we need students. And I also believe that the need for universal climate literacy is growing. I believe it will become the central focus of educational systems within the next 2 to maybe 5 years. And I know that this is a massive challenge because we have polls showing that the vast majority of parents and teachers support climate education. But on the other hand, we have no definition of climate literacy. We have no public education in climate literacy to speak of. We have no state or national policies. And we have an abysmal record of literacy and educational organizations that have completely ignored climate change so far. So it was pretty much treated as an option, like if you're interested in this, explore it as a hobby. But that's not something that individuals can do in their own spare time. We need a concerted systemic effort. And this need, this gap for climate literacy is now being recognized. In 2019, NCTE became the first professional organization in education to issue a statement on climate change and literacy teaching. In 2020, New Jersey became the first state in the US to mandate climate education at every grade level. Also in the late 2020, a letter was written to President-elect Joseph Biden by former secretaries of education, urging President Biden to support climate literacy everywhere. And as we speak, a work group within IRSCL is currently drafting our organization's position statement on climate change and climate literacy. So all these efforts are part of the push for building universal climate literacy in the US and across the world, and we can really do it together. Wrapping this up, I want to leave you with 5 rules of thumb I developed in my thinking about climate literacy, and with one specific climate literacy initiative. So these principles of climate literacy pedagogy come from my chapter, which is forthcoming from Lexington Books in the book Literature for Change. And it's, of course, not an exhaustive list, but something that reflects my personal experience in the classroom. So the first principle is that teaching about climate change should be at the heart of our educational practice. Like that we should center these stories and include discussions about climate change in any subject or any areas we teach. The second principle that I followed was that considerations of climate change are potentially traumatic issues. So as teachers, we need to learn to manage and diffuse climate anxiety in our classrooms. The third one is that because addressing climate change is primarily a challenge for our imaginations and story systems, we should look for stories that mobilize climate action. And there are more and more of these stories. 4, teaching about climate change would be a wasted opportunity unless it empowered students to rediscover hope. So centering stories of hope for the planet is really, and this larger community of life is really important and a very powerful tool. And the 5th principle is that we really need to start using new vocabulary, new concepts, new frameworks to learn about climate change. It's a whole new language, and because this whole new language is required for us to radically transform how we imagine ourselves in relation to the biosphere. So this new transformative language is super, super important. And the example of this literacy, climate literacy initiative is Climate Lit, which Justina mentioned, and this I co-founded this with Lara Sigisak last year. So imagine we can teach climate literacy from kindergarten all the way up through high school. Imagine we give children specific story-rich examples to understand what is at stake and how they can be agents of change. Imagine we empower young people with vocabulary with which they can call out environmental injustice and articulate visions of sustainable, equitable futures. And imagine we gave teachers a resource where they can find specific recommendations for books, nonfiction, films, apps, and all other formats they can use to teach climate literacy. So that's the vision for Climate Lit. And at the heart of it is an open access searchable database of children's literature and media. And there are related functionalities like the glossary, events. Climate Loom is going to be the space for our pocket journal, which we're in the process of creating. And then there are different levels for people to get involved, different types of activities. So the idea for this site is to create a hub of resources for teachers, parents, general public, grandparents, for everyone, free and open access to the public. So that's what we're doing. And that's the email address for, that's the URL address for Climate Lit. So how do we build climate literacy? One step at a time. There's no single formula. There's no single standard. The only singularity we have is that this existential crisis is also an opportunity. We have to learn climate literacy as we go, and we have to help our students become climate literate defenders of this planet. To become a climate literate society, we need education to lead the way. To transition to an ecological civilization, we need stories to inspire us, perhaps even show us how to get there. Stories, games, and all other narrative media for young people are not additional, but they're the most important avenues for building universal climate literacy from the ground up all the way through educational systems. Because there's no planet B, and because we all deserve a future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marek. I'm just trying to switch the camera on. Yes. Once again, thank you very much for all these insights, and I think for stressing the role of the central role of the humanities in education for climate. I do wish that, well, I hope that we get education for climate in Poland as well. It's a problematic issue, political issue, in fact. But once again, thank you very much for showing us ways in which we can all get involved, whatever we do, at whatever positions we are as scholars and students. There is time for questions now. Please post the questions in the chat. Yes, there is a first question, but let me, I will read it in a moment from Maciej. Thank you very much, Maciej. But let me just say that, of course, you can also raise your hands and ask the questions directly. Marek, I don't know if you can see the chat, but
No.
I will read I'll read the question. So Maciej is asking, how can we create a blueprint for climate education that centers hope and mitigates climate anxiety? I noticed that the vast majority of climate activists prefer to strike fear into the hearts of people and so control them. And then Maciej adds, oppressions, caring instead of liberation. So that's the first question. Thank you, Maciej.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. I don't have a very clear answer. I do know that a number of scholars over the past maybe 3-4 years, that there is a shift going away from dystopia into explorations of hope. Like, what does hope mean? How is hope, for example, for 6-year-olds? How would hope be different for, older audiences like 12-year-olds or 15-year-olds? How does hope work in the narratives that are visual versus narratives that are more textual? So these are, it's a lot of really hard questions that require very specific examples and very careful analysis. I do believe that this shift is happening, and there is several books. I'm always on the lookout for books that generate this sort of hopeful, empowering structure for thinking about the challenges facing us here and now. And my sense is that there is more. And, it's not like we expect authors to give us the exact blueprint or formula. Okay, here's what you do, and here's what gets you to the result. But authors also experiment with stories, and stories are living entities that, authors put certain things in stories, and sometimes it takes off, sometimes it just falls flat, because stories have their own dynamics. But a lot of this experimentation is already happening. And I believe that this effort will accelerate, and we need conferences, we need professional meetings, we need teachers to get together and discuss these things and share insights and figure out ways to do it in our classrooms. So it's a huge challenge. We've never done it before, but it's very urgent. And I think more and more people are on board that we should really be very intentional about it now.
Thank you very much, Marek. And then we have another question in the chat from Alan. Thank you very much, Alan. Dear Professor Oziewicz, thank you for an interesting and thought-provoking lecture. If you were to seek for certain methods available nowadays to improve learners' climate literacy, for instance, in the EFL classroom, what those methods would be when we think solely about the language education? Do you think that the climate-oriented content should be more prominent in the modern textbooks?
Oh, thank you, Alan. That's actually 3 questions or more, but it's yes. So one initiative that I'm familiar with, and it depends on the audience. If you're working with younger children, the strategies would be different. If you're working with middle schoolers or high schoolers, strategies would still be different. But one initiative that I know is happening, including in Minneapolis and across the United States, is the nearby nature education. So the idea is that you start with young children and you do as many lessons outside in which students learn the names of plants, the names of critters, birds, bugs that live in their immediate neighborhood. And this is also a very good strategy for learning new words, for vocabulary, development of vocabulary. But it centers the most immediate environment in which these young people function so that they are able to distinguish 3 different types of grass, 4 different types of bugs, when maybe they learn about this bug as part of that larger family, and they learn something about what this larger family of bugs, what are its functions in the biosphere or in this local ecosystem. So there are wonderful ways, and I know that teachers are already doing this across the board. But the problem is that teachers are doing this work sort of smuggling this climate or biodiversity related content into existing curricula. And this, it works, of course, but we need to support systemic solutions so that teachers are not only allowed, but encouraged and empowered and supported to do this work, and not reliant on just their own individual inventiveness, the sources that I just found for this class, but they have a larger community of other teachers with which they can exchange ideas and build strategies and test strategies that work. We don't have frameworks yet. We have a little bit of frameworks for environmental education, but I've been reading about it a little bit, and it seems that increasingly there is a sense that environmental education, as we have it today, was invented with the purpose of living in the world of the 1990s, that it's no longer adequate to the challenges that we're facing today. So it's a massive challenge, but I think that as educators, as teachers, as academics, this is really our job to figure this out and then push for this systemic change in national and international educational systems.
Thank you very much. There is a question, there's a hand raised. So Nina, please.
Yes, because hello, thank you. My chat, I don't know how it works here, but so I just wanted to thank you, Marek, for the encouraging talk, and also for all your initiatives. Especially, I'm very happy about the climate literacy page, because it's a wonderful thing to share with students and teachers all over the world, and it's a great resource, I think, for all those who want to work on this topic. And I think I also sent to you, Justina, just 2 links to the Norwegian curriculum, the school curriculum, because I think maybe it can be some encouraging text there for all those countries who are still miss, an overall initiative for sustainable education. And I think that's something I really appreciate when you mentioned the close to nature, in nature, place-based teaching, everything, that you can also do this with literature. And I think embedded in for instance, the description of the cross-disciplinary theme about sustainable development in the curriculum for the Norwegian subject, there is, I think, a key word which is also important in this nature, close to nature, in nature, is the concept of negotiation, dialogue, and this is also linked to the question about hope, because I think students need to touch the problems, to get in touch with them, and to negotiate and learn to, deal with them. Because there's no quick fix. So you really have, don't you think so? This is my, what do you think about this? How to say it? To show students that there are dilemmas, and that you have to find a way to know how you think yourself with these dilemmas. For instance,
Yes, it's really complex, and of course students should be made aware of how we're talking about multiple interacting systems, political systems, economic systems, educational systems, energy systems, and so forth. So there is a level of complexity that is productive, but I think that this level changes depending on the audience's age, that we have the opportunity to design structures for doing this work effectively with kindergarten age kids. We have the opportunity to design different strategies and different focus areas for elementary education kids or early elementary and so forth. So there is a way to scaffold this learning so that it's spread out across different age groups, that it's spread out across different subject areas that students take, and that at each level and subject area, we created this zone of proximal development, the Vygotsky's concept, like this idea, this opening, where they see, okay, here's something new that I haven't considered, but here's something that also is an opportunity. So I don't have any solutions. I believe we really need to have a conversation, really intense conversation, not just educators and literature scholars and humanists in general. It also absolutely needs to involve teachers on the ground. They need what their students understand. They know what their students will relate to. So it needs to be very practical. Unless it's practical, it's never going to work. So yes, we should be doing a lot and more and across the board. Thank you, Nina.
Well, thank you, Nina, for the links. I have shared them and I will forward them to Marek. And let me say that if anyone is interested in the links and you don't have access to the chat, please let me know. Email me and I will share them, of course. There is a question in the chat and a number of questions, I think even 2 questions in the chat and still 2 questions to be asked directly. But first, a question from Eleonora. I will read it. Thank you so much for the amazing lecture. I'm happy I was able to hear it. I wonder whether you have any advice on how to approach the topic of climate change in a classroom with adult students that do not believe in climate change or feel too afraid to talk about in a way that they would feel encouraged, not threatened. And I do second that question. Students do feel burdened. I had a student in my class on the Anthropocene and children's literature who said that she and her friends are wondering if they are going to, or if they should, to have children. Mm-hmm. So these kind of sentiments as well, if you could maybe address this. Marek, thank you.
All of the forms of therapy we have developed in psychology and psychotherapy, all of them are conversation-based. So my sense is that really the first step is to open up a conversation, including a conversation in which people can feel free and safe to articulate the questions that freak them out, that they're really so scared to even think about it, let alone admit that they're having these, anxieties or doubts and grief and whatnot. So like starting the conversation is really step number 1. And in a lot of spaces, this conversation has not started. So in adult spaces, there was an article recently based on a study that was done in 2020, which pretty much concluded that we are in this paradoxical situation that adults in today's world are, the vast majority of adults is climate illiterate for whatever reasons, political, religious, ideological, whatnot. And these adults are shaping the world for a generation of young people who are the most climate literate generation ever, of humans ever. So this is a sort of parallel, like the transition we had a while ago between digital immigrants and digital natives, where teachers and adults were digital immigrants who were teaching young people who are digital natives. So it's a similar situation with climate literacy and illiteracy. And I cannot just right off the bat tell you what strategies would work with adult audiences, especially audiences that are in denial for whatever reasons. But I know that there are people, scholars and educators working on these strategies. And so it's something that can be found, so that these things exist. And but then again, I personally probably would not want to invest too much of my energy debating deniers. There was a wonderful chapter by Rupert Reed in his 2018 book, Whether We Should Debate Deniers or Not. And the example he brings up is that when in school you discuss evolution, you're not supposed to bring creationist or a priest to balance, perspectives. And or when you discuss geology, the history of the geological history of the planet, you're not supposed to bring a theologian in class to balance the story of the Earth's creation with, oh no, really, but another story is this. So we're not supposed to do that. And why we are doing so when you talk about human rights or minority rights, you're not supposed to bring a Nazi into your classroom and offer students an alternative perspective, and the Nazi would say, well, really, the Aryan people are the best and everyone else is below them and really subhuman. We're not having these discussions. So why are we having these discussions about climate change? So I think it's a sort of false premise that views need to be balanced, because this is really a denial strategy that has worked for a very long time. It was a strategy that was designed by big oil and corporate interests to slow awareness and action on climate change. So if I had a choice to teach a group of 800 5-year-olds versus a group of 3 climate deniers adults, I would totally go for 5-year-olds, because there is something you can do with these young people who are open, and there is the struggle to convince someone who is in this denying position. I just don't know if it's worth it. I don't know.
Thank you very much, Marek. Thank you for this question as well, Elnora. Let's now have a question, direct question from Terry, please.
Thank you to the organizers at the University of Wrocław. And Marek, thank you. This was very inspiring. I have an observation and a question. So observation, I'm teaching for the second year a first-year course that's on environmental literature and geography that I team teach with a geographer. At the beginning of this term, one of the students said that she wasn't sure if she should take the course because she was worried it would be damaging to her mental health. So this is that matter you spoke of, climate anxiety. And we had a discussion and agreed that we had to find space for hope. And what's really become apparent to me in the course material is that it is actually the literature, it's the stories, it's the poems, the prose nonfiction pieces. That's where the hope's from. And the other piece that I've learned from teaching this course, and here's where the question comes in. We've shaped the course around exploring different ways of understanding the environment through Western science, through environmental humanities, and through indigenous ways of knowing. Mm-hmm. And that's the last area that I think, have you been doing any explorations in, Nina mentioned conversations, and I wonder, there is a place, I think, for incorporating indigenous voices and indigenous science, indigenous philosophies maybe?
Yes, there is a lot happening with this, and indigenous knowledges, indigenous stewardship practices, like practices of being with the land, practices of kinship, of being with, wild life and non-human nature. These are extremely inspiring and very powerful models that are being used already in many ways. So the answer is yes. The answer to, managing, how do we manage climate anxiety? And, for teachers, like the example you quoted with the student saying that she's not sure if she should take the course because it's so freaking stressful, to think about these issues. That's a very, very challenging aspect and especially for teachers, because you're not just teaching stuff, but you are supposed to manage your own climate anxiety and climate grief, and also manage the climate grief and anxiety of all of your students who bring very different perspectives and very different ways to be worried, not only because they're younger, but, so I absolutely believe that our education systems, regular schools and, college level institutions should offer support to academics and teachers about how to deal with these potentially trauma-generating topics. And we don't have this yet. Again, like it's another thing that, okay, we need it, but we don't have it yet. There is a book coming out next year for which I wrote a piece on climate grief. And the entire book okay, I'm blanking on the title, but it's about climate emotions. And it's like 30-something chapters about very different climate emotions and the context of a classroom or teaching about these emotions or engaging with these emotions. So my sense is that this work is already also happening, and I don't have like any specific tips in terms of like how to manage this. It's a very challenging thing. I agree.
Thank you. If I may add, for another project, I've read quite a lot of literature, secondary literature in psychology related to, indeed, psychotherapies concerning earth feelings, let's call it this way, problematic earth feelings, eco-despair, eco-fear, and so on. So there's a lot of work. I think I'm not a specialist. I cannot recount, these texts right now, but there is a lot of work going on also in psychology, I think. And it will be probably, more and more, I guess, psychologists will be involved in treating, unfortunately, of course, in treating these fears, anxieties, and despair. We have a related question, I think, from Tanya in the chat. Thank you, Marek, for your lecture. Do you think that dystopian literature works as support for climate literacy, or does it undermine it? Does dystopian literature feed too much into rapture ideologies?
Thank you, Tanya. Yes, I think so. My thinking about dystopia now is sort of ambivalent, because I know that dystopias were really the first line of defense. Dystopia in literature was this first group of or genre, very dispersed genre, that confronted head on, the questions of biospheric collapse and whatnot. So, and dystopia has done some good work, and I think that a lot of dystopia is useful. Then again, dystopia as a general trend, sort of dystopia generalized, and by now it seems to be counterproductive. But I also know that dystopia has evolved. And now we are having a number of recent works of dystopia that are dystopian, but also have these hopeful components embedded in them. But they're more mindful about highlighting this hope component versus that I'm going to scare you out of your socks with this story. So like it's more balanced now. So I do believe that dystopia has a place, but we used to somehow assume that dystopia is all of the answer you need. It's not. So, and then it depends also on personality types. I know students who love dystopia and who feel inspired by dystopia, but I've had students who, when they take the first sniff of dystopia in any story, they just move away immediately because they don't want to be further traumatized. So it really depends. So I guess that was one part of the question, and I forgot what the other part of the question was. But I think that we are now more utopian / hopeful works are being created now than 5 or 10 years in the past. We pretty much at that point, we had a complete domination of dystopia.
Yeah, the second part of the question was about rapture ideologies, whether dystopian literature feeds into...
Yes, I think that dystopia has accelerated the creation of rapture ideologies very much. I mean, it was like throwing gasoline on fire. I mean...
Okay, thank you, Marek. And Piotr, please, now your turn, a direct question.
Thank you, Marek, for the fantastic lecture. Really interesting for me as ecologist, biologist, but really interesting. A lot of information, but first of all, emotions. Emotions for me is the most important in this topic. And I totally agree that there are no more important topic now for in literacy, in education, in science, in our life. So great job, your job. You mentioned that in climate literacy we need ecocentric values. What should these values be around which we are building the story? To what extent, in your opinion, should they be anthropogenic, or do we need fundamentally non-anthropogenic values in stories when we talk to children, to students?
That's a great question. Thank you. So yeah, I have been struggling with versions of this question for a while now, and I'm reading as much as I can about like what is this sweet spot between anthropocentric versus ecocentric, systems. I do believe that we are able to adopt a lot of ecocentric values that we can embed in our stories, but at the same time, storytelling and language, the kind of language we use as human beings, is a very anthropocentric tool. It's something that in many ways does set us apart from animals, that we can speculate, we can create, grammatical tenses, past, future, whatnot. Like if in animals and other creatures that talk, we know that everything talks, but we don't really have equivalents of these things in the non-human world. So I think the challenge is to identify ecocentric values as much as possible and center them in stories that we tell, but with stories that are either told by or told to or involve human agents. So this creating this sense that we are part of a larger family of beings, or maybe we are part of a larger organism, superorganism called Gaia. So if there are stories that develop kinship between, humans and mammals, that's great. If you have stories that develop kinship between humans and insects, maybe also, so beyond mammals, that's even better. If you can do stories with oceans and natural elements, plants, oh, that's great. So we should be looking for these specific strategies, and a number of these strategies. I'm actually working on an article, a short piece about new animism, because maybe one of the perspective, and this sort of ties into Terry's suggestion about indigenous voices, indigenous knowledges, that most traditional indigenous cultures, their worldview is largely animistic. So it projects levels of sentience and levels of aliveness and levels of consciousness on the natural world around us. Trees are alive and conscious in different ways than humans, than insects, than bears and other living creatures. But it's levels, so it's degree, not in kind. And I do think that a lot of recent children's literature is actually going in this direction, like very subtly communicating to young readers that everything is alive. You just need to be open and curious enough to notice it. You can ignore it and cut yourself apart from the natural world, but it's a choice. It's not the way things are, it's a choice. So I do think that there is a tremendous space for more of these ecocentric values in the stories we tell. And this first clip that I showed, it's called The Dream, where it's animal fantasy, where you have animal protagonists speaking, singing, articulating their ideological positions, and you also have humans in that clip, but humans are presented as monsters. They're sort of disfigured bodies. They have these glowing monster eyes. So the position of persons versus monsters is flipped, and animals are shown as persons, and humans are shown as these unthinking, zombie-like, destructive invader monsters. And this is one way that a clip shows to its audience the aliveness of the world and how what humans do in very real way impacts the capacities for life that these other forms have. So I believe it is happening, and I would be super interested to see the study, longitudinal study of young people today, let's say people who are 7 today, and then let's see when they're 17, what is their perception of aliveness of the world? And my guess is that if these stories work, if this transition is happening, we will see more and more people sort of admitting to or embracing a position in which, yes, I am alive, I am a person, but I am just one type of person among these other. There are bird people, tree people, bear people, water people, and this is 100% aligned with most of the traditional wisdoms, like the Dakota people in Minnesota. They talk about pretty much everything else is akin to humans, and these other beings, trees, birds, badgers, are people also, but they're different people than human people, but they're people nevertheless. So I hope it's happening. Because otherwise, if you assume that everything else is really dead or organic the way that cheese is organic, that it sort of evolves and can go bad, but it's really not alive in a meaningful sense, this attitude leads to destroying the planet because it's just a thing.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much for the question, first of all, and thank you for the great answer. And we have a question again from Maciej. Would you agree with the statement that rapture ideologies are fueled by greed and can be countered by inspiring awe? You pronounced it correctly. Ava.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think rapture ideologies are fueled by fear. That the dynamic here that we're seeing is the dynamic of fear versus the dynamic of hope/empowerment. And fear can be based on greed, but my sense is that greed is secondary. Fear is number one driver. And we know from psychology and we know from history that fear, as one of the primal emotions, fear can be a very powerful driver of human behavior and human motivations. So the fear that you will lose everything, the fear that you will die, the fear that you will be overwhelmed and events will swipe you away, you will be not in control of anything. Those kinds of fear is a very, very powerful motivator, but it's short-termist. And we don't have any examples of any productive developments, long-term productive developments that were built on fear. So, and there's a ton of rapture ideologies. And if you Google up Jamie Wheal, he talks about these rapture ideologies in many contexts. Yuval Noah Harari sort of talks about rapture ideologies in different contexts. He doesn't use the term rapture ideologies. I really like the term. I think it's a good term to capture a broad variety of ideologies. These techno dreams of Silicon Valley that we will create this space civilization, we will fly to the moon, everyone will have a great life in space, the Star Trek thing. But what they don't mention is the cost, and that it will really be a handful of people. And they don't really mention that even if you had the greatest life on Mars, it would not compare to going out into your garden and just seeing a live tree or a piece of grass or a grasshopper, or like Mars is completely barren. And if humans relocated to Mars, this would be the ultimate of the Anthropocene isolation. It's just that the entire life, everything you define as life, would be just humans, nothing else. That sounds like a cage to me, not like an aspiration.
Thank you very much, Marek, for addressing this. We have maybe time for one
Sure.
question. Are there any more comments or questions? I can't see any in the chat, and I can't see any hands raised. But if I may just have a question or a comment. I've just read a very interesting article about climate literacies. It has been published recently by Bowman and Germain, I think that's the pronunciation. But it's about a kind of participatory approach to climate education or climate literacy, relying more on, let's say, children's or young people's knowledge, which they are producing. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking here about We Rise, for example, by Martinez, which is a guide, mm-hmm. apart from being a kind of autobiography and a compendium. Well, there is a lot of his experience there, which kind of gets translated into indeed how to become an activist, for example, mm-hmm. But many other things as well. So what this article suggests is this kind of is maybe moving away from this kind of top-down approach, so relying so much on education, like formal education, schools, because they have failed, as you were saying, and the environmental education has failed. And maybe trying to move more towards intergenerational, let's say, collaborations between, again, children and teachers, and relying on teachers' knowledge, children's knowledge, children's experience. Something that Nina, I think, also mentioned, right? Yeah. Children getting to know the world, but also gaining their own knowledge and then sharing it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, but, I mean, absolutely. I do not imagine any climate literacy education without this component. Like that, the idea is that we need to create frameworks where children and students in school and outside of school, they can own this thing, that they feel like they're doing it. It's because they are concerned. They want to know. They want to be the actors. They want to be the shapers of their lives instead of falling into the roles that adults prescribed to them, including this, top-down transmission of knowledge, wait with activism until you grow up, then maybe you can vote, and then maybe you can do a change. Like, no. So and young people know that this is a false promise. And of course, the more we can empower young people to be the drivers of these conversations, of these local projects, initiatives, the more they are involved, the better. That's yes, absolutely. And again, this is also a thing that we have some experience with, but not nearly enough, right? Like we need to develop these structures where young people feel that they have the support, from teachers, parents, from schools, from whatever organizations or whatever they do, to do this work and to be deeply involved in this work, and that it counts as their work rather than, it's just your hobby, but school is serious, so focus on school first and then do your hobby later. No, that's like the proportion is just counterproductive. So yes, absolutely. I would be very interested to see these initiatives develop further. Mm-hmm.
I would even say that maybe this empowering, is kind of two-directional. I mean, young people strikes, I think they have empowered a lot of adults.
Yes, that too.
So it goes both ways, I think.
It goes both ways. Absolutely. Yes.
For sure. Okay, I will share the article with you, Marek, later. And of course, if anyone is interested, please let me know. But thank you once again. Thank you very much for the great lecture and for the discussion, which has been just amazing. So many insights, so many questions still for all of us to grapple with. Thank you very much, all of you, for the questions, first of all, and for the discussion as well, for sharing some links. Thank you.